Alaska is on another level. You can drive for hours, days even, and see nothing but untamed wilderness.
You're so cute.
This isn't the typical environment for people to survive in, but Alaska is thriving because of oil.
An $8 billion extraction plan, thousands more jobs.
But the oil industry is in deep trouble. The production of crude oil has been in decline for decades, and not because viable reserves are running dry. This affects every Alaskan man and woman. Oil makes up over 90% of Alaska's general fund, which pays for its schools, roads, and public services. It was also used to build a sovereign wealth fund, which now is worth over $80 billion. And Alaskan residents receive yearly dividend payments.
And the amount this year is
$1,884.
Oil keeps the lights on and the engines running, but it is forcefully being shut down. This is the real reason why Alaskan oil is dying, with hindsight. Alaska's development is inextricably connected to natural resources. It was first inhabited over 15,000 years ago by people who followed herd animals from Siberia. All major cities of Alaska today have their origins in the mining sector. Without mining and oil in particular, Alaska would not have become a US state. And an abundant number of natural resources are still in the ground. The Pebble deposit, for example, is widely regarded to be the world's largest undeveloped system of gold. Similarly, on Alaska's North Slope, there remain tens of billions of barrels of oil in the ground. But before we get to why this sector is in decline, let's start by how mining created Alaska. In the 1840s, Alaska was part of Russia. Russian settlers were trading fur with natives, and they had found some traces of gold, but nothing of major significance. When the United States purchased the land, it was incorporated as the Department of Alaska, and a few years later, a major discovery was made. Two men set out from Sitka to explore the rugged Alaska Panhandle. They commissioned a local native chief and set ashore a small village that was popular amongst natives for its rich fishing grounds. And they found a major deposit of gold. This started a gold rush in the region. Thousands of prospectors traveled north from the American West Coast in search of quick riches in Alaska. This gave rise to cities like Nome and Fairbanks. That first discovery produced over $7 billion worth of gold, and the adjacent town was renamed Juneau after one of the original prospectors. The discovery of gold was a game-changer for Alaska. The department was previously seen a useless Arctic wilderness, but these discoveries created excitement about the region, and in 1912, it was incorporated as the Territory of Alaska. It was generating millions in revenue each year, which added to the urgency to build infrastructure to connect the most valuable towns, particularly Fairbanks. And a plan was approved to build a railway from Fairbanks to the port of Seward on the Gulf of Alaska. In 1914, a government survey vessel was driving along the coastline and entered an inlet. They studied the geography and reported back that this was, in their opinion, the perfect spot for a hub to service the construction of this railroad. The town started as a tent city and developed into what is now Anchorage. The development of Alaska was largely directed by the mining industry and later the military. Their farthest islands lie just 2,000 kilometers away from Japan, and the territory can be used to project power in the Pacific and in the Arctic Ocean. This strategic position became of major importance during World War II, when Alaska saw a massive buildup of military facilities and the federal government invested considerably in building new infrastructure. This provided an economic boost for Alaska, but still, between mining and this investment from the military, they were still dependent on money from Washington to make ends meet. And this was turning into a problem. Alaskan residents felt distant from policymakers in Washington, and they wanted a stronger voice in national decisions. But to get these rights, And to be accepted as a state, they needed to first prove that they could financially support themselves. And that's what oil did. In 1957, the first major discovery of oil on the Kenai Peninsula helped Alaskans argue its case for statehood, and 2 years later, Alaska was proclaimed the 49th US state. But its economy was promising at best. The next years, they had to show that they could financially support themselves. And to help with this goal, the federal government put Alaska's first governor in charge of picking 100 million acres of land, or roughly a quarter, to become state-owned. He focused primarily on land near the Cook Inlet, close to where most people lived. And his priority was to pick lands that could be used for multiple purposes, like timber, parks, recreation, and of course, land that was believed to contain valuable resources. These were decisions of major consequence, and one geologist had a controversial idea. He had his eyes on a ragged chunk of Arctic coastline. The geology here reminded him of big oil basins that he had seen in Wyoming. The only detail was that it would require an astronomical investment to transport any oil that was found here to harbors on the Gulf of Alaska. The governor was therefore not too keen on this idea, but US oil companies applied pressure, and ultimately he relented. Prudhoe Bay was selected as state-owned land. This was the beginning of a high-risk venture. Several rigs were installed, and nothing came up. For this venture to become economically feasible, it would require the discovery of a field with at least 1 billion barrels of oil. But what they found exceeded all expectations.
A colossal oil field dwarfing any previous discovery on the North American continent.
It was the biggest discovery in North America. Oil fever whips across Alaska. Prudhoe Bay is changing the oil world. The field that they found was believed to contain 25 billion barrels of oil, and as preparations were made, another field was discovered, which was the second largest in North America. An oil bonanza, but the problem is to get it out. There were early talks about shipping the oil through the Canadian Arctic. This would be twice as fast as shipping through the Panama Canal. But they eventually settled on a plan to build a pipeline from Prudhoe Bay in the Arctic with 12 different pump stations to Valdez on the Gulf. There was an urgency to complete the project. A few years after oil was discovered, the world entered an oil crisis. The price of oil doubled in 1 year and quadrupled over a decade. This increased the importance of the North Slope discovery, but its production was delayed for years. The main reason was this pipeline. It would cross sensitive Arctic habitats, and it would pose a perpetual risk of leaks and spills. Alaska natives depended on this habitat, and some communities felt that they were not adequately consulted or compensated for the use of their traditional lands.
Ceremonies kick off the start of the actual Trans-Alaska pipeline construction, the largest private undertaking in the world.
Years of court battles ensued, and after almost a decade of talks and litigation, the pipeline was opened. As oil began flowing from Alaska's North Slope, the total production increased substantially. Almost overnight, oil became the most important segment of the economy. By 2007, half of all jobs in Alaska were either directly or indirectly dependent on the petroleum industry. So, why has production been decreasing since the 1990s?
It's not that they're running out of oil here in Alaska. The oil industry says there's still billions of barrels of oil in the North Slope alone. The problem, the oil companies say, is taxes.
It is trying to create local investment and thousands of jobs. But there is likely to be a significant backlash from environmental organizations.
When a deposit is found and a plan for its extraction has been made, they must work with 11 federal and state government agencies to get 60 individual permits. This often takes years. And when oil finally starts flowing, it costs twice as much as the national average to produce, leading
to a lack of industry interest.
There's other places I can spend my money with less risk, less upfront cost, less litigation.
Many oil companies are just not too keen anymore on investing in developing Alaska's North Slope. The oil that now flows through the pipeline is a fraction of what it was at its peak in 1988, when Alaska was the top producer in the United States.
When California eclipsed us, that was embarrassing. They are the most overregulated, overtaxed place on the face of the planet, well, in the United States.
If we don't change things, we could be outsurpassed by Oklahoma.
Declining oil revenues are felt by all Alaskan residents.
The amount of the 2012 dividend this year is $878.
Less activity from oil producers leads to less investment and less income to the state and its residents. And other industries like timber, tourism, and seafood just can't fill this gap. Alaska is at a disadvantage. The region's vast size, harsh climate, and distance from major markets makes doing business more expensive. Temperatures are rising, and the melting of the permafrost renders much of the equipment useless in summer. These oil fields have been in production for decades, which means that by now the most accessible oil has been depleted. Much is left, but it's harder to reach. Whereas in the lower 48 states, opportunities like shale oil have made doing business in states like Texas and North Dakota more attractive. If Alaska wants to become a preferred destination for oil investment, it needs to do more.
We have more liquid gold under our feet than any nation on earth. Drill, baby, drill.
Trump is unlikely to change things. He signed an executive order that reopened vast areas for drilling and mining. But one of the challenges is that much of Alaska's remaining oil is on land owned by the federal government, which means that oil companies need to deal with federal, state, and local governments. This process takes years, and a new administration could easily reverse Trump's move. The long-term trend is that Alaskans are willing to go to extreme lengths to find a balance between being good environmental stewards while taking advantage of their natural resources.
It's not only the worst oil spill in U.S. history, it's by far the largest in such a remote, pristine area.
They have a history of environmental disasters, and they have a lot to lose.
In 3 oiled salmon spawning streams, where there normally would be tens of thousands of salmon eggs or juvenile forms, biologists this spring have been unable to find a single egg or fry.
The Pebble Mine, the world's largest untapped reserve of gold, was closed over concerns that it could pollute waters of the Prudhoe Bay, one of the richest salmon habitats on the planet. On Alaska's North Slope, the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge has been at the center of debate. This is the largest protected wilderness in the United States, and it's an important calving ground for porcupine caribou. Recent administrations have been going back and forth on whether to allow drilling in the region, and Trump declared it open. But most US voters are against it, and most oil companies aren't eager to start a process that could be blocked by a future administration. The petroleum industry has done a lot of good for Alaska, and mining in general has been a driving force of development, but they don't receive a lot of credit. If a plan is approved, Alaska's exceptionally thorough regulatory processes, environmental and indigenous groups have made sure that it's been done in the most responsible, legal way possible. That brings me to the investing part of this video. If you are anything like me, you've been checking your broker constantly these last 2 weeks. Tariffs and a trade war with China. These all present amazing opportunities, and I want to highlight one in particular. This week in Reuters, I read that China's rare earth exports grind to a halt. And Trump responded the following day by saying that he plans to stockpile deep-sea metals. One of the most pressing concerns is the access to rare earth minerals and critical metals. And I believe that in the coming years, we're going to see that more of these are going to be mined in the United States, especially those that are critical for the US defense industry. And a particularly good example of this would be tungsten. Tungsten has the highest melting point of any metal, making it indispensable for applications that require high heat resistance, durability, and strength. But there are zero, as in none, actively producing tungsten mines on US soil. Just look it up. The Department of Energy lists tungsten as one of the critical metals. The United States is currently importing the majority of its tungsten from China, and that's where I see a great opportunity. American tungsten, US ticker DEMRF, and the sponsor of today's video, could become the first tungsten producer on US soil after a full decade of no tungsten mining whatsoever domestically. DEMRF stock is down 61% from its peak 2 months ago, as markets have sold off across the world. So I feel compelled to bring this to your attention now. There are known tungsten deposits all across the American West Coast, all the way up to Alaska. American Tungsten is looking to resume a former mine. It is based right here in Idaho. It used to be the 5th largest operational tungsten mine in the United States, when it was still operational decades ago. This video about Alaska showed how complex regulatory frameworks can form a difficult barrier for mining companies. But right now, that's not the case. Idaho is widely considered to have one of the least burdensome mining regulation in the nation. I'll provide a link to a PDF in the pinned comment and in the description where you can read exactly what American Tungsten is planning to do here in the United States. But also do your own homework. I'll provide the sources for the sponsored segment as well as the rest of the video for a link in the description like I always do. And maybe this will help the United States become less dependent on China and you can be a shareholder. Here's my advice. Start by reviewing the PDF and you'll see why I am so excited about this.